Howdy folks, and welcome back to Home with the Gnome. Today I'm going to be taking a stab at cooking something that I've wanted to do for ages, and which I've seen described under various different names. I think Sam the cooking guy called it glazed pork bites or something like that. Other people call them pork burnt ends. Now I've had burnt ends before, usually beef, and usually out of the packet, and usually not very good. The problem with beef burnt ends, I mean they can be very good, but the fat that you get on a piece of beef tends to not be particularly nice. Pork burnt ends, and I'm going to be using belly pork, the thing about pork fat is it's good, especially belly pork fat. And belly pork is about 50-50 pork, fat and meat anyway. The difference is that when it crisps up, it's just pure flavour, in a way that beef fat kind of really isn't. So let's take a look at the piece of belly pork and I'll show you exactly what it is that we're going to do. So here's my piece of belly pork. I haven't quite finished, well, I hesitate to use the word butchering it, but let's say butchering it because I still have to remove the bones. Unfortunately it's not a deboned piece of belly pork, but I have, as you can see here, removed the skin. Now I've seen people do this both ways, skin on, skin off. Obviously I've removed the skin, so I'm going to be doing it skin off, although I will be cooking the skin separately because that stuff is gorgeous. The reason why I've taken it off is because it just complicates the process of cooking the rest of the pork. The thing about pork belly skin is that it has to be blasted at high temperature in order to crisp up. You have to salt it to remove as much moisture as possible, and so on and so on. And if you cook the whole thing at high temperature, the pork meat turns to shoe leather. You need to cook this slow and low in order for it to become tender and to crisp up and juicify, yes that is a word, all the fat, of which there is a lot. But if you were to cook that at a low temperature for a long period of time, that turns to rubber. So just to keep things simple, I've taken the skin off. It was not easy, unfortunately. I do have an extremely sharp knife. And now I have to get rid of the bones from this because it's not a deboned piece of pork. And when that's done, we'll crack on with what comes next. Okay, several minutes later, and this is what we've got. These cubes of belly pork are basically going to be the pork burnt ends. But over here, I also have the pork ribs, which I'll cook separately as pork ribs. And I'm also going to slice up the skin and cook that as pork crackling strips. So we've basically got a sort of pork meat smorgasbord going on over here. The next step is going to be to dress the pork cubes. The next step is to get a rub onto that cubed belly pork. Now, what you're going for here is flavour, not heat. I don't want this particularly hot because, well, I'm going to be adding a sweet sticky glaze to the belly pork about 2/3 of the way through the cooking process. So what we're looking for here is flavour. Bearing that in mind, I've ground up a couple of my own chilies here. I've added some mild chili powder and a bit of paprika, and we want to get that all over these. And here we go. Now if you lived in the USA, particularly the southern USA, states like Texas for example, where there's a strong barbecue culture, you'd be able to just go out and buy a bottle of barbecue rub. That's not really a thing in this country, where we get like 3 sunny days a year. Similarly, we don't have smokers. Ideally, you'd want to smoke this pork for a good 3 hours. But, well, we don't tend to have meat smokers in this country, so instead we're going to use the oven. It's on a very low temperature, around about 250 to 275 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 135 degrees Celsius. It's going to go in there for a good 2 to 3 hours. And as you can see, I'm also doing the pork ribs, since they also need to be slow cooked. While that's in the oven, I'm going to be making up a sticky glaze, which is going to be used to coat pretty much everything that you see here, after about 2 to 3 hours are up. Now, when it comes to making a glaze for your barbecue, again, if you live in the USA or any other country where barbecue is part of the culture, you can just go to your local store and buy barbecue glaze. Again, I've had to get inventive and make my own. And I've used a couple of things that you can find anywhere in Britain, and if you can't, you need to move. HP sauce. It's kind of like barbecue sauce, but it isn't. Canadians, you'll know what this stuff is. It's delicious. It's fantastic on chips. It's great on bacon. It's a sauce that you use with meat as opposed to tomato ketchup. And it's quite sweet and it's quite tangy. And I've mixed that up with a whole bunch of pure honey because I want a sweet, sticky glaze to go onto the pork and the ribs after they've spent about 2 hours in the oven. One other thing, I intend to use all of that pork skin to make some crackling strips. Now this is going to have to be cooked separately because the pork is cooked at a low temperature in order for that fat to reduce down and just, you know, become tender and, oh, well, you know what slow cooked pork tastes like. The skin, on the other hand, must be cooked at a very high temperature in order to crackle up and turn into crackling. And plus it needs to be salted and kept in the fridge for at least 30 minutes to an hour beforehand. So I've just salted up the skin. That's going to go in the fridge, and when the pork in the oven is about an hour to go, this is going to come out. I'll cut it into strips, and then that will go in separately on an extremely high temperature, and that should crackle up very, very nicely. Okay, this was actually in this state after only an hour and a half. Now what we're going to do is we're going to glaze the pork ribs, and we're going to take the leftover glaze, and there should be most of it left over. Just have to do the ribs on both sides, so I'm going to do it on this side and then I'll put it back on the baking tray or roasting tray and do the other side, and then all the rest of that is going to go in there with the pork burnt ends. Now that it's all been glazed, that's how the pork ribs look, and that is how the burnt ends look. Trust me, they smell fantastic. They're going to go back in the oven, same temperature, 130, 135 Celsius, 250, 275 Celsius for another 30 minutes, just to get that glaze nice and sticky and stuck on and cooked in. And then they're going to come out and we're going to eat them. Now, while all of that's in the oven, just cooking off that glaze, there's still about 20 minutes to go, and I have taken all of the skin off the back of that pork belly, which has been salting in the fridge for about 2 hours, cut it into strips, and that's going to go in the oven as well. I may as well stick it in now, in order to form into strips of crackling. This is not something I've ever really tried to do before. When everything else comes out of the oven, I'm going to whack the temperature up as high as it will go, because for crackling to crisp up nicely, you really do need to cook it on very, very high temperature. So basically as high as your oven will go. And then once everything comes out, because the crackling should take 20 minutes or less, we'll see how it all looks, and more importantly, how it all tastes. And there it is. The pork burnt ends, the inexpertly cut ribs, and the crackling strips. When these came out of the oven, I have to admit, I did taste one. I had to wait a further 20 minutes for the crackling strips to be done. You cannot begin to imagine the effort at will that it took to not eat the rest of those while those were finishing. Oh, these are delicious. Anyway, let's call in the Portuguese judge and see what she thinks. Okay, my mouth's full of pork crackling strips, so you're just going to have to make it up as you go along.
Alright. So, you got pork scratchings?
Basically, yeah.
Alright. Pork ribs?
Yep.
And...
pork burnt ends.
Pork burnt ends, okay. I'm gonna start with the scratchings. I'm actually not a big fan of scratchings. So if I like this, you did a really good job. Ooh.
Oh yeah, baby.
Wow. This is really good.
Oh no, I'm eating one. Oh no, I'm eating one.
I like it is cracking, but it's like doesn't feel like it's breaking your teeth. Yeah.
It's crunchy. It's not chewy.
Exactly. Like usually with pork scratchings, I don't have any, situation like that in my mouth, but I do worry because it feels just really too hard on the teeth. This is just perfect. Let me try the ribs. Oh, it's sticky. Oh, look at that. Oh, look at that.
I made my own glaze because you just can't really buy barbecue glaze. Well, you can buy barbecue glaze in this country, but it's difficult to get a hold of. So I made my own from HP sauce and honey.
I like that.
If you like that, you're going to love the pork burnt ends. It's like candy, but it's meat.
So I can. That is really good. Okay, I'm gonna try a tiny bit because usually those are the best.
The bits that are blackened all around.
Yeah, I love the black in the meat. Yes. Oh.
Oh, you don't like pork belly, do you?
Oh my god.
Because it's too fatty.
Oh my god.
It's the fat that gives the flavour. It just has to be cooked properly.
Oh. This is a wet dream on a plate. Oh my god.
Well, don't get too excited because half of that's mine. Right. So, pork burnt ends, pork crackling strips, and some very, I have to admit, inexpertly sliced pork ribs. Not a single piece wasted from that mammoth piece of pork belly that you saw earlier.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I'm going to call that one a success. This one I will definitely be doing again.
Oh, it's just the perfect amount of salt, perfect amount of sweetness, perfect amount of fat versus meat. And there's a bit of a tanginess there as well in those.
Look at you eating the crackling.
Oh. Who am
Rita,
I?
you don't like pork crackling?
Who am I? Oh god. Oh. Yeah, stinko.
Right. Let's eat. Take care, folks.
Oh, so good though.